where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
What if everything you believed about love, loyalty, and justice was built on a lie? Here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to admit. Sometimes the people we're taught to trust are the real villains, while the ones we're told to fear are actually innocent. Sounds crazy, right? But stick with me, because this story, this fictional tale from the era of dukes and duchesses, will flip everything you think you know about betrayal, revenge, and unexpected love completely upside down. Picture this. You're forced to marry the man everyone says murdered your brother, the man whose name is whispered with fear in every ballroom, the man whose reputation is so dark that even mentioning him makes people uncomfortable. You'd spend every waking moment planning his downfall, right? Dreaming of the day you expose him, destroy him, make him pay for what he took from you. That's exactly what she planned to do. Walk down that aisle, play the obedient wife, and systematically uncover proof of his guilt. Simple revenge plot. Clean narrative. Good versus evil. Except, here's where it gets twisted. What happens when the monster you married starts looking less like a villain and more like a victim? What happens when the evidence you're desperately searching for points in a completely different direction? What happens when you realize the real conspiracy isn't what you thought, and the actual murderers have been sitting at your family's dinner table all along, smiling while they serve you lies with your evening tea? That's the enigma that'll unravel in this story. A mystery so deep that uncovering it doesn't bring closure. It brings chaos. See? We love simple stories. Hero and villain, black and white. Good people over here, bad people over there. Life's easier when you know who to hate and who to trust. But reality? Reality is messy and complicated and full of secrets that destroy everything you thought was solid ground. This young woman walked into her forced marriage carrying one truth. Her husband was a killer who deserved punishment. She walked out carrying a completely different truth. The people she loved most had orchestrated the biggest deception of her life, and the man she'd sworn to destroy was the only one who'd tried to save her brother. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds too dramatic to be real. And you're right, because this is a fictional story, a tale inspired by the intrigue and power plays that happened throughout history among nobility. But here's why it matters. The themes are timeless. Forced choices, hidden conspiracies, the courage it takes to face uncomfortable truths, the way love can grow in the most unlikely circumstances when it's built on honesty rather than illusion. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're human experiences that echo through every generation. Here's the controversial part that'll probably upset some people. Sometimes seeking revenge against the wrong person is easier than accepting that the people you love are capable of terrible things. It's more comfortable to hate a stranger than to acknowledge your own family's darkness. She could have stayed in her hatred, could have refused to see evidence that contradicted her narrative, could have chosen the comfortable lie over the painful truth. Most people would have. Most people do, every single day, in ways big and small. But that's not where transformation happens. That's not where real justice lives. So if you've ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted, if you've ever discovered that a story you believed was built on deception, if you've ever had to choose between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truths, this story is going to resonate in ways you might not expect. We're about to dive into a tale of forced marriage, hidden murder, family betrayal, and the kind of love that emerges not despite the darkness, but because two people chose to face it together. Fair warning, This isn't a fairy tale with easy answers. It's raw, it's complex, and it'll make you question everything about loyalty, justice, and what it really means to see someone clearly. Ready to uncover the truth? Let's begin where all the best mysteries start, with a young woman standing in a garden, watering roses, about to receive news that'll destroy her world, and eventually rebuild it into something she never imagined possible. You know when you grab a hot pan without realizing it? In those first few seconds, you can actually hold it. But when the heat spreads through your skin, your body screams at you to let go. That's exactly how it felt, hearing her father say she'd marry the Duke. But unlike the pan, she couldn't simply let go. There's this weight that comes with duty, with family honor, with expectations that were carved into stone long before you were even born. It's invisible, sure, but it's heavier than any chain they could have wrapped around her wrists. And the twisted part? Society tells you it's not a prison, it's a privilege. You should be grateful, they whisper. You should smile and accept your fate like every proper lady before you. She remembers the exact moment her world shattered into a million pieces. She was in the garden, watering the roses her mother planted before she passed away. Those roses were the only thing connecting her to her mother, to her brother, to some sense of normalcy in a life that felt increasingly like a performance. Her father approached with that military posture he always had when delivering bad news. Shoulders back, chin up, eyes cold as winter stones. "You'll marry the Duke of Thornfield in 3 weeks," he announced. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a discussion. It was a declaration, final as a judge's gavel. She dropped the watering can, watching the water spread across the soil, darkening it like blood-staining cloth. All she could think was, "This is the man who killed my brother. This is the man who destroyed everything." But here's where the enigma deepens, where the silence becomes deafening. When she looked into her father's eyes, she saw something that terrified her more than the order itself. She saw fear. Her father, the general who'd commanded armies, who'd faced death on countless battlefields without flinching, was afraid. What kind of man inspires fear in a warrior? What kind of conspiracy runs so deep that it forces a father to sacrifice his daughter? The traces of her old life were crumbling, and she didn't even understand why. There were codes here she couldn't decipher, rules written in invisible ink that everyone seemed to know except her. And somewhere in that confusion, she realized this wasn't just about marriage or alliances. This was about survival. Let's talk about what she knew regarding the Duke of Thornfield before that garden revelation. His reputation preceded him like a shadow that swallows light. They said he was cold, ruthlessly efficient, a man who showed no mercy to his enemies. Whispers followed him through every ballroom, every social gathering, tales of mysterious deaths, of people who crossed him and simply disappeared. Some claimed he'd killed 3 men in a duel over a perceived slight. Others swore he'd orchestrated the downfall of entire families who stood in his way. Whether these stories held truth or were merely the product of fearful imagination, she couldn't say. But when you hear the same forbidden tales repeated in hushed tones across drawing rooms and servants' quarters alike, you start believing there must be fire beneath all that smoke. The conflict tearing through her chest was unbearable, like being pulled apart by wild horses running in opposite directions. On one side stood family duty, the weight of generations of tradition, the expectation that daughters sacrifice their happiness for political gain. Her father needed this alliance. She could see it in his desperation, in the way his hands trembled slightly when he spoke of the marriage. Their family's position, perhaps even their survival, depended on this union. But on the other side raged something far more primal, far more human, the burning need for justice. How could she marry the man who murdered her brother? How could she share a home, a name, a life with someone whose hands were stained with her siblings' blood? It felt like betraying her brother's memory, like saying his life didn't matter enough to fight for truth. The political debts her father owed were like quicksand. The more you struggle, the deeper you sink. She started piecing together fragments of conversations she'd overheard, documents she'd glimpsed in his study, tensions she'd sensed, but never fully understood. Their family had made promises, formed alliances that now demanded payment. The Duke of Thornfield held significant influence at court, controlled vast lands, commanded loyalty from powerful figures. Refusing this marriage wouldn't just upset one man, it would shake the entire foundation of their family's standing. They'd be ruined socially, perhaps even financially. Her father had gambled their future on relationships that now required her as the final bet. It's fascinating, in the darkest way, how women throughout history have been currency in men's games of power. But here's what haunted her most during those 3 weeks of preparation: the lost possibilities, the stolen future. She'd imagined her wedding day since childhood, like most girls do. She'd pictured marrying someone she loved, someone who made her laugh, someone who looked at her like she was their entire world. Instead, she was walking toward a union built on secrets and bloodshed. Every fitting for the wedding dress felt like preparing for her own funeral. Every meeting with the wedding planner felt like arranging the details of her imprisonment. And through it all, one question kept echoing in her mind like a haunting melody she couldn't escape. What if there's more to this story? What if the truth is hidden beneath layers of deception she hasn't even begun to uncover? The countdown to the wedding felt like watching an hourglass drain, knowing each falling grain brought her closer to a fate she couldn't escape. She tried researching more about the Duke, but information was scarce, contradictory, wrapped in mystery. Some servants who'd worked at his estate spoke of him with genuine respect, which confused her. Wouldn't a murderer inspire fear rather than loyalty? Other sources confirmed the violent reputation, the dangerous aura surrounding him. The more she searched for clarity, the deeper the enigma became. It was like trying to see through fog. Shapes appeared and disappeared, truth and rumor blended until she couldn't distinguish one from the other. And beneath all this uncertainty lived one terrifying revelation. She was about to bind her life to a man she knew nothing about, except that he might have killed the person she loved most. And then came the day. The day she'd walk down that aisle toward a man everyone called an assassin. The day her old life would end, and something new, something she couldn't yet name, would begin. You ever watch those horror films where the protagonist walks slowly toward danger, and you're sitting there screaming, "Don't go, turn back"? That's exactly what it felt like. Except there was no turning back. And she was simultaneously the protagonist and the audience watching in horror. The chapel felt like it existed in another dimension, a place where warmth couldn't reach, where joy had been banned by some ancient decree. It wasn't the cold of climate, it was August, one of the hottest months of the year. This was a coldness that emanated from people, from the weight of secrets pressing down on everyone's shoulders. No smiles, no celebration, just obligated witnesses watching a forced union unfold like a tragic play where everyone knew the ending. She walked down that aisle wearing the dress her mother had dreamed she'd wear on her wedding day. Her mother had imagined this moment filled with flowers, with music, with pure joy radiating from every corner. Not this funeral disguised as a ceremony. Each step felt heavier than the last, like walking through water that grew deeper with every movement forward. The silence in that chapel was deafening. You could hear fabric rustling, shoes clicking against stone, breathing that seemed too loud in the absence of any genuine emotion. And then she saw him up close for the first time. Alexandra Thornfield, the Duke, the man accused of killing her brother, the assassin she'd been handed to like a peace offering to appease some hidden force she didn't fully understand. But here's what shocked her in that first moment. It wasn't coldness in his eyes. It wasn't the indifference she'd braced herself for, the cruelty she'd expected to see. It was sadness. Deep, ancient sadness, like he'd been carrying it for lifetimes and had grown accustomed to its weight. He looked at her, not with possession or triumph, but with something that resembled regret. Sympathy? It threw her completely off balance. She'd prepared herself to face a monster, had steeled her heart against a villain. But the man standing at that altar looked more like a prisoner than a captor. His jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid, and in his eyes lived a story she couldn't yet read. It was the first crack in the narrative she'd been told, the first trace that maybe, just maybe, nothing was as it seemed. The vows felt like poison on her tongue. Each word was a lie, each promise a betrayal of everything she believed in. To love and to cherish. How do you love the man who destroyed your family? In sickness and in health. How do you care for someone you'd planned to see brought to justice? Till death do us part. Death had already parted her from her brother, and this man was supposedly responsible. She spoke the words because she had no choice, because the codes of society demanded it, because her father's desperate eyes pleaded with her from the front row. But inside, she was screaming. Inside, she was planning. Inside, she was making a different vow, to uncover the truth, no matter what it cost. The first night at the castle was stranger than she'd imagined. She'd expected confrontation, perhaps violence, maybe cold indifference. Instead, the Duke led her through corridors lined with paintings of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow their movement, stopped at a door, and simply said, "This is your room. Mine is at the other end of the hall. You won't be disturbed." That was it. No demands. No expectations. No explanation. He established rules with such simplicity, it felt almost anticlimactic. Separate quarters, minimal interaction, complete autonomy within the estate. It was like he was trying to make her imprisonment as comfortable as possible, which somehow made it more unsettling. What kind of captor gives his prisoner freedom? What kind of husband keeps such distance from his wife? She spent that first week in a state of constant tension, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Every creak in the hallway made her jump. Every footstep outside her door sent her heart racing. But nothing happened. The Duke was almost invisible. She'd catch glimpses of him in the library, hear his voice giving instructions to staff, see him riding across the estate grounds at dawn, but he never approached her, never demanded her presence, never exercised any of the rights a husband supposedly had over his wife. It was this silence that became most maddening. She'd prepared for battle and found herself in a strange truce she didn't understand. The mystery deepened with every passing day. What confused her even more was how the staff treated him. She'd expected to find frightened servants, people walking on eggshells, the kind of fearful obedience that comes from working for a cruel master. Instead, she witnessed something completely different. The housekeeper spoke to him with genuine warmth. The stable boy joked with him about a horse's stubbornness. The cook prepared his favorite meals, not out of obligation, but what seemed like actual affection. These weren't people afraid of their employer. These were people who respected him, maybe even cared for him. How does a murderer inspire such loyalty? How does a man with a reputation for violence create an environment where people feel safe enough to laugh in his presence? On the seventh night, unable to sleep, she wandered the castle's corridors. The place was massive, labyrinthine, filled with shadows that seemed to hold secrets in their depths. She found herself in front of the library, a room she'd been avoiding because her brother had loved books, and the grief was still too raw. But curiosity won over pain. Inside, she discovered something that made her breath catch, an entire section dedicated to literature her brother had adored. First editions of philosophy texts he'd quoted endlessly, poetry collections he'd memorized, historical accounts he'd discussed passionately at dinner. Either this was the cruelest coincidence, or there was a connection here she'd never been told about. The enigma was growing, expanding, refusing to fit into the simple narrative of villain and victim. But it was in that library, running her fingers along book spines her brother might have touched, that things started to not make sense. Really not make sense. And she realized her mission might be more complicated than she'd ever imagined. You know those antique porcelain cups that look perfect at first glance? But when you hold them up to the light, you see the hairline cracks spreading like spider webs throughout the surface. The story she'd been told about the Duke was exactly like that. Too perfect, too convenient. And the more she held it up to the light, the more cracks she discovered. Truth has a funny way of revealing itself, doesn't it? Not all at once, like some dramatic revelation in a stage play. No, it seeps through slowly, like water finding every tiny fissure in a dam, until the whole structure becomes questionable. She'd come to this marriage with absolute certainty about who the villain was. But certainty, she was learning, is often just ignorance wearing confidence like a disguise. She had a plan from day one. Observe, investigate, find concrete proof of what he'd done to her brother. And then, well, she hadn't figured out the then part yet. Justice? Revenge? Simply the truth. But on the third day, something bizarre shattered her expectations completely. She woke up around 3 in the morning with a terrible thirst, the kind that makes your throat feel like sandpaper and your mouth taste like dust. She went downstairs to the kitchen, deliberately avoiding the servants because she didn't want to interact with anyone, didn't want to pretend everything was normal. That's when she heard voices drifting from one of the side rooms, low, patient voices that didn't match the late hour or the silence of the sleeping estate. Curiosity pulled her forward like a hook in her chest. She peeked through the partially open door and nearly gasped at what she saw. The Duke was there, sitting at a simple wooden table with a young boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. And he was teaching the kid to read. Not with impatience or condescension, but with genuine gentleness that seemed impossible for the man she'd been told he was. No, Thomas, that word's different. See, let me show you again, the Duke said, pointing at the letters with careful attention. The boy struggled, clearly frustrated with himself, but the Duke just smiled, actually smiled, and encouraged him to try once more. This was supposed to be the cruel man who'd killed her brother. This was the monster from all those whispered tales. The contradiction hit her like a physical blow. She started paying closer attention after that night, looking for traces of the truth beneath the reputation. Small observations began piling up, each one contradicting the narrative she'd been fed since her brother's death. The way the gardener's daughter ran up to the Duke without fear, showing him a butterfly she'd caught. How he'd funded repairs for the village church without any fanfare or expectation of public recognition. The fact that every servant in the household had at least 1 day off per week, unheard of in most noble estates where staff worked 7 days straight. These weren't the actions of a heartless killer. These were the choices of someone who actually cared about the people around him, who saw them as human beings rather than tools for his convenience. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Or rather, started changing everything. She was exploring the estate grounds, trying to map out the property in her mind, when she stumbled upon a building she hadn't noticed before. It was well-maintained but modest, tucked away near the edge of the Duke's lands like a secret he wasn't advertising. Children's laughter spilled from the windows, genuine carefree laughter that seemed out of place in her grim investigation. She approached carefully and realized it was an orphanage. A fully funded, beautifully kept orphanage that the Duke apparently supported entirely from his own pocket. No one had mentioned this. No gossip had included this detail. Why would a supposedly violent, selfish man quietly care for dozens of children who had nothing to offer him in return? The library became her obsession after that first night. She'd return there every evening, drawn by the mystery of those books her brother had loved. She'd run her fingers along the spines, pull out volumes at random, search for any clue about the connection between the Duke and her sibling. And then, one evening, she found it. A small inscription inside a philosophy text. Her brother's handwriting, clear as day. To A, who understands truth better than most. May this bring you the peace you deserve. A. Alexandre. Her brother had given this book to the Duke. They'd known each other. They'd shared interests, conversations, perhaps even friendship. Why had no one told her this? What other revelations were hiding in plain sight, waiting to destroy her certainty? The Duke never pressured her, never threatened her, never even raised his voice in her presence. In fact, he seemed to go out of his way to avoid making her uncomfortable. If they passed each other in a hallway, he'd nod politely and continue on. If they had to share a meal due to social obligations, he'd make small talk about neutral topics, the weather, the estate's harvest, local news, nothing personal, nothing demanding. He treated her less like a wife and more like a guest he respected but kept at arm's length. This restraint puzzled her. Men in his position typically exercised power over their wives without hesitation. Society gave them that right, expected it even. So why did this man, accused of the worst kind of violence, show her nothing but distant courtesy? The conflict inside her grew more intense with each passing day. On one hand, she'd come here with a mission: expose the man who destroyed her family, bring him to justice, honor her brother's memory by refusing to let his killer walk free. On the other hand, every observation contradicted that mission. Every interaction showed her a different person than the one she'd been told to hate. It's exhausting, living with that kind of cognitive dissonance. Your brain keeps trying to make the pieces fit, to force the reality you're experiencing into the story you were told. But the pieces don't fit. They clash and scrape and refuse to create the picture you expected. And somewhere in that frustration, she started asking different questions. Not, how do I prove he's guilty? But, what if I've been lied to? And then, on a rainy afternoon while the Duke was away on business, she made a discovery that would crack her certainty wide open. She found the diary, her brother's diary. Hidden in the Duke's private study, tucked behind other books like a treasure someone wanted to keep close but couldn't bear to display. The moment she saw that familiar handwriting on the first page, everything she thought she knew began to crumble. You know when you open Pandora's box? Everyone knows the story. Once opened, it can never be closed again. All the chaos, all the truth, all the things that were better left hidden come spilling out, and there's no way to stuff them back in. Finding that diary, was her Pandora's box. And what was inside destroyed every certainty she'd been clinging to, every assumption she'd built her mission upon. Sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't a weapon or a threat. It's information that changes everything you thought you knew. Information that forces you to question not just one person, but everyone who told you the original story. That diary was a bomb waiting to explode her entire understanding of reality. She was in his study. Yes, she'd invaded his private space, and no, she's not proud of it. Searching for evidence. Letters that might incriminate him, financial records showing payoffs to assassins, anything that would confirm what she'd been told about him being a murderer. The room smelled like leather and old paper, that distinctive scent libraries have when they're filled with knowledge and secrets. She'd been methodical, checking drawers, examining documents, looking behind paintings for hidden safes. That's when she noticed something odd about the bookshelf. One section looked different, like books had been arranged to conceal rather than display. She pulled a few volumes forward, and there it was. A leather-bound journal, worn from use. The pages yellowed at the edges. When she opened it and saw the handwriting, her heart stopped beating. Just froze in her chest, like time itself had paused. It was her brother's distinctive script, the way he looped his L's, the slight slant to his words, the occasional smudge where his hand had dragged across wet ink because he wrote too fast for his thoughts to keep up. Her brother's diary was in the library of the man accused of killing him. The irony was almost poetic, wasn't it? The evidence she'd been desperately seeking, but not the kind she'd expected to find. Not proof of guilt, but traces of a connection that no one had bothered to mention. She sat down right there on the floor, legs giving out beneath her, and started reading with trembling hands. The first entries were mundane, observations about court politics, complaints about tedious social obligations, jokes about pompous nobles who took themselves too seriously. Her brother's voice came through so clearly it hurt, like he was sitting beside her reading aloud. But then, about halfway through, the tone shifted dramatically. He started writing about discovering something disturbing, something that made him question people he'd trusted his entire life. "There's corruption deeper than I imagined," one entry read. "Money disappearing from charitable funds, documents being forged, people in power using their positions to steal from those who have nothing." He didn't name names initially, just circled around the conspiracy, like he was afraid to write the truth, even in his private journal. As she kept reading, her brother's investigation unfolded like a mystery novel, except this was real life and the stakes were life and death. He documented meetings between nobles who shouldn't have been meeting, financial transactions that made no sense, threats made against people who asked too many questions. He wrote about feeling isolated, about not knowing who he could trust anymore, about the weight of carrying. The revelation that shook her most came in an entry dated 3 weeks before her brother's death. "I need to tell Alexandra the truth. He's the only one I can trust with this. His reputation protects him in a way. People fear him too much to try silencing him like they might silence me. If something happens to me, at least the information will survive. Alexandra." Her brother called the Duke by his first name. Not the Duke of Thornfield, or His Grace, or any formal title. Just Alexandra, like they were equals, like they were friends. The simplicity of that familiarity hit harder than any dramatic confession could have. Friends don't murder friends. Friends trust each other with dangerous secrets. She flipped to the final entries, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the pages. Her brother wrote about his fear growing, about sensing he was being watched, about realizing the conspiracy went higher than he'd initially thought. "They know I know," he scribbled in what looked like hurried handwriting. I saw them following me yesterday. I need to meet with Alexandra tonight. Need to give him copies of everything I've found. Need to make sure this doesn't die with me if they... The sentence cut off, just stopped mid-thought like he'd been interrupted or had run out of time. The next page was blank, and the one after that. The codes of the conspiracy remained partially hidden, but the pattern was clear enough to be terrifying. The last actual entry was dated the night her brother died. Her vision blurred with tears as she read his final written words. Meeting Alexandra at midnight near the old bridge. He promised to help me expose them all. He's risking everything by standing with me. They could destroy his reputation, his position, everything he's worked for. But he said truth matters more than safety. That's why he's my best friend. That's why I trust him with my life. After tonight, everything changes. After tonight, justice finally comes for the guilty. She had to stop reading, had to press her hand against her mouth to keep from sobbing out loud. Her brother had trusted the Duke, had called him his best friend, had met him that night seeking help, not suspecting betrayal. But here's what broke her completely. The realization that slammed into her like a physical force. If her brother trusted the Duke, if they were meeting to expose corruption together, if Alexandra was supposed to be helping him, then what actually happened that night? The story she'd been told, that the Duke murdered her brother in cold blood, suddenly made no sense. None of it added up. Conspiracies don't work if you go around killing people in obvious ways. They work through silence, through misdirection, through making sure the truth gets buried along with its discoverers. And the best way to bury truth? Blame it on someone else. Make sure the real killers can point at a convenient scapegoat while they escape into the shadows. She sat there on the floor of the Duke's study, holding her brother's diary, understanding finally clicking into place, like puzzle pieces she'd been trying to force into wrong positions. Alexandra wasn't the villain of this story. He was another victim. And she'd been played. They'd all been played. By people who understood that the best way to hide a murder is to give everyone an obvious suspect to hate. You ever put together a jigsaw puzzle and realize some pieces were from a completely different box? You try forcing them to fit because you're so convinced they belong there, but the image never looks right. Something's always off, always distorted, always wrong. She'd been forcing pieces of this murder story into the narrative she'd been told, hammering them into place with pure willpower and grief. But the image was wrong. Completely, devastatingly wrong. And now, holding her brother's diary, she finally understood why. The truth wasn't what she'd been told. The truth was hidden beneath layers of deception so thick that even well-meaning people had believed the lies. She confronted him that same night. Couldn't wait, couldn't plan, couldn't think strategically. The moment she heard his footsteps returning to the estate, she marched straight to the dining room where he typically took his evening meal alone. She slammed the diary onto the table while he was cutting into his food, the sound echoing through the silent room like a gunshot. "You were his friend," she said. Not a question. Not an accusation. Just a statement of fact that demanded acknowledgement. The Duke's fork froze halfway to his mouth. He stared at the diary for a long moment, and she watched something break in his expression. Not surprise, but resignation, like he'd been waiting for this moment since the day she arrived. He set down his fork with careful precision, the kind of deliberate movement people make when they're trying to maintain control of their emotions. "He was my best friend," Alexandra said quietly, his voice rough like he hadn't spoken those words aloud in months. The only person who saw past the reputation, past the fear, past all the silence I wrapped around myself for protection. He believed in me when everyone else saw a monster. The pain in his voice was so raw, so genuine, that it cut through her anger like a knife through cloth. This wasn't the confession of a killer. This was the grief of someone who'd lost a person they loved. She'd recognized that grief because she'd been living with it herself. Then why did you kill him? Her voice cracked on the question, tears burning behind her eyes. She'd been holding on to this anger for so long, using it as armor against her own pain. But now the armor was crumbling, and she didn't know what was underneath. The Duke looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw tears forming in his own eyes. The first genuine emotion she'd witnessed from him since their wedding day. "I didn't kill him," he said, each word weighted with something that felt like truth. "I tried to save him. God help me. I tried everything I could, but I failed." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with implications she was only beginning to understand. Alexandra stood up from the table, walked to the window overlooking the dark estate grounds, and began telling her about that night. His version. The real version. The one nobody had bothered to ask about because they'd already decided he was guilty. "Your brother came to me 3 weeks before he died," the Duke began, his back still to her as if he couldn't bear to see her face while he spoke. He'd discovered corruption at the highest levels of the court. Nobles stealing from charitable funds, falsifying documents, using their positions to enrich themselves while people starved. He had proof, documents, ledgers, witness testimonies, enough to bring down some of the most powerful families in the kingdom. She listened, barely breathing, as the puzzle pieces started arranging themselves into a completely different picture. "We planned carefully," Alexandra continued, his reflection in the window glass showing the pain etched into his features. "We knew these people were dangerous, knew they'd kill to protect their secrets. So we made copies of everything, hid them in different locations, prepared to present the evidence to the king himself. That night, the night he died, we were supposed to meet at the old bridge to finalize our strategy. I got there early because I was paranoid about security. That paranoia saved my life and cost me his." He paused, his hands clenching into fists against the window frame. "They were waiting for us. Not just 1 or 2 hired thugs, but a coordinated attack. Professional killers who knew exactly when and where we'd be." The Duke turned to face her then, and the devastation in his eyes was almost too much to witness. "I fought them. Killed 3, injured 2 others, but there were too many. They got past me, got to your brother, before I could stop them. By the time I reached him, he was—" Alexandra's voice broke completely. He took a shuddering breath before continuing. "He was dying, bleeding out on the ground, and there was nothing I could do. No way to save him. I held him, tried to stop the bleeding, screamed for help that didn't come fast enough. And his last words—" He stopped, closing his eyes like the memory was physically painful. "What did he say?" she whispered, needing to know even though she was terrified of the answer. Alexandra opened his eyes and looked directly at her. He said, "Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her it wasn't her fault. Tell her to be careful. They'll come for her too if she asks questions. He was dying, in agony, and he was worried about you. Wanted me to protect you. Made me promise." The revelation hit her like a wave, drowning her in emotions she couldn't name. Her brother's last thoughts had been of her safety. And the man she'd been hating, the man she'd blamed for everything, had been trying to honor that dying wish by staying away, by not pulling her into the conspiracy, by keeping her at a distance to keep her safe. "But why didn't you tell anyone the truth?" she asked. confusion and anger and grief all tangled together in her chest. Why let them blame you? Why accept being called a murderer? Alexandra laughed bitterly, a sound completely devoid of humor. Because the people who killed him are powerful enough to make any truth I spoke sound like lies. Because coming forward would have meant revealing the conspiracy before we had enough proof to protect ourselves. Because... He hesitated, then finished quietly. Because your brother died in my arms, and maybe I deserve to be punished for failing to save him. Easier to accept the world's hatred than to live with my own. The silence that followed was deafening. She stood there, diary still clutched in her hands, understanding finally that the enemy wasn't standing in front of her. The enemy was hidden behind smiles and social niceties, behind positions of power and carefully constructed reputations. The enemy had been sitting at her family's dinner table while she grieved, had probably attended the funeral, had definitely orchestrated this entire marriage to silence the one man who knew the truth and had evidence to prove it. And she'd played right into their hands, hating the only person who'd actually tried to save her brother's life. Sometimes the monster isn't hiding in the shadows, lurking in dark corners, waiting to pounce. Sometimes the monster is sitting at the dinner table, smiling, passing the salt, asking about your day like they actually care. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones you'd never suspect, the ones who've perfected the art of wearing humanity like a costume while darkness festers underneath. That's the worst kind of betrayal, isn't it? Not the betrayal of a stranger or an obvious enemy. It's the betrayal of someone who held you when you cried, who promised to protect you, who looked you in the eyes and lied so smoothly you never questioned a single word. That's the kind of treachery that doesn't just hurt. It fundamentally changes how you see the world. After Alexandra told her the truth about that night, they became unlikely allies. Two people who should have been enemies, forced together by grief and a shared need for justice. They started investigating together, digging through the evidence her brother had collected, following trails he'd marked in his diary. And the more they investigated, the more obvious it became. The conspiracy wasn't some distant, abstract thing involving strangers. It was close, painfully, horrifyingly close. She'd look at Alexandra across the table where they'd spread documents and ledgers and see the same dread in his eyes that she felt in her gut. The kind of dread that comes from knowing you're about to uncover something that'll destroy whatever innocence you have left. The breakthrough came 3 weeks into their investigation. They'd been examining financial records Alexandra had managed to hide before the attack. Documents her brother had entrusted to him days before his death. Patterns emerged like constellations in a night sky, once you knew where to look. Money flowing from charitable funds into private accounts. Signatures forged on property transfers. Backdated documents that made theft look legal. And the names? God. The names attached to these transactions read like a guest list from every major social event she'd attended. Duke Harrison, who'd dandled her on his knee as a child. Lady Pemberton, who'd taught her embroidery. Lord Ashworth, who'd given a touching eulogy at her brother's funeral. All of them stealing, all of them complicit. But the worst revelation was still coming. She was going through correspondence, letters her brother had copied before his death, when she found exchanges between the conspirators discussing how to handle the problem. That's what they called her brother. A problem. Like he was an inconvenient stain on fine fabric, rather than a human being fighting for what was right. One letter in particular made her hands shake so violently she nearly dropped it. The general's son has become too dangerous. We need permanent silence. Make it look like Thornfield's work. His reputation makes him the perfect scapegoat. No one will question it. The letter was signed with initials, R.W. Her father's initials. She couldn't breathe. Literally felt like someone had wrapped hands around her throat and squeezed. Her own father had known. Not just known about the conspiracy, but participated in it. Been part of the decision to kill her brother. She ran to the bathroom and vomited, her body rejecting this truth as violently as her mind tried to. Alexandra found her there, held her hair back while she was sick, didn't say a word, because what words exist for that kind of betrayal? Your father orchestrating your brother's murder. Your father using that murder to trap you in a marriage designed to silence the one man who could expose them all. It was monstrous in a way that defied comprehension. They found more evidence as they dug deeper. Letters between her father and the other conspirators dated after her brother's death, discussing how to control the narrative. They'd invented stories about Alexandra, spread rumors through carefully placed whispers, made sure everyone believed the Duke was a violent killer. And the marriage, the forced, rushed marriage, had been the final chess move. By binding her to Alexandra, they'd created a situation where exposing the truth would destroy her reputation too. She'd be seen as complicit, as someone who'd known and covered it up. The codes of their conspiracy were brilliant in their cruelty. Keep your enemies close, keep them compromised, keep them silent through mutual destruction. But here's what shattered her completely. Discovering who actually killed her brother. They found payment records, proof of money transferred to hired assassins. And the source of that payment wasn't her father, though he'd approved it. It came from someone else's account, someone who'd visited their home weekly, someone who'd called her dear niece and promised to watch over her after her brother's death, someone who'd looked her in the eyes at the wedding and smiled like he was happy for her. Her uncle, her mother's brother, the man who'd taught her to ride horses, who'd brought her sweets when she was sad, who'd been a constant presence in her life since she was born. She confronted the evidence with Alexandra beside her, both of them staring at documents that proved her uncle had personally ordered the hit, had paid the assassins, had probably been there that night, watching from a distance while her brother died. He was the one skimming the most money, Alexandra said quietly, pointing to financial records. Tens of thousands over the years. Your brother discovered it first. That's what started his whole investigation. He found proof that your uncle was stealing from war widows' funds, from orphan relief programs, from disaster aid. Taking money meant for people who'd lost everything. The hidden schemes were laid bare now, impossible to deny or rationalize away. The final piece fell into place when they found her uncle's journal. Yes, apparently keeping incriminating diaries runs in families. He'd hidden it in their family estate, probably never imagining she'd go looking. In it, he detailed everything: the conspiracy, the corruption, the murder. But what made it truly damning was his reasoning. He didn't express regret or moral conflict. He wrote about it like a business transaction. The boy was becoming problematic, had to be eliminated, used Thornfield's reputation to deflect suspicion, worked perfectly, even convinced my own brother-in-law to marry off the girl to keep everyone quiet. No loose ends. Her brother was a problem to be eliminated. She was a loose end to be tied up through forced marriage. They were just obstacles to him, not human beings he'd supposedly loved. She sat with that journal on her lap, understanding finally settling over her like a heavy blanket. The real assassin of her brother had dined at their home every Sunday, had hugged her at the funeral, had whispered condolences while knowing exactly how her brother had died. Because he'd ordered it. The man who promised her father he'd look after her was the same man who'd orchestrated this entire nightmare. And her father. Her father had known. Maybe not everything, maybe he'd convinced himself his brother-in-law had good reasons, but he'd known enough. He'd chosen his political survival over his children. Both of them. The conflict inside her was unbearable. Part of her wanted to scream, to rage, to burn everything down. But another part, the part that had been trained in duty and propriety since birth, kept whispering that these were family. These were people she was supposed to love and protect. That internal battle between justice and loyalty was tearing her apart, until she looked at Alexandra and remembered her brother had chosen truth over safety, had chosen what was right over what was comfortable, and in his memory, she could do no less. The trace of his courage lived in her, demanding she finish what he started. You ever see those movies where sworn enemies become allies because they discover a bigger threat? It's like when rival superheroes have to team up to fight the actual villain, putting aside their differences because survival matters more than pride. Except this wasn't a movie with a guaranteed happy ending. This was real life, messy and complicated and terrifying. She'd spent months hating the man who turned out to be innocent, while the real monsters smiled at her across dinner tables. And now, in the strangest twist fate could have designed, the person she'd planned to destroy had become the only person she could trust. Life's funny that way, not ha-ha funny, but rather that dark, ironic kind of funny that makes you question everything you thought you knew about justice and truth. The first night after discovering everything, after learning her uncle was the killer, after realizing her father's complicity, after understanding the depth of the conspiracy that had stolen her brother, she couldn't sleep, couldn't even close her eyes without seeing her uncle's handwriting describing murder like it was a business expense. Around 3 in the morning, she found herself standing outside Alexandra's door, her hand raised to knock but frozen in indecision. What do you even say? Sorry I hated you for months while planning your downfall? But before she could decide, the door opened. He stood there fully dressed, like he hadn't been sleeping either, and simply stepped aside to let her in without a word. I spent 3 months hating you, she said once they were both sitting in chairs by his fireplace, staring at flames that provided warmth but no comfort. 3 months planning ways to make you pay for what I thought you'd done. Imagined confronting you at dinner parties, exposing you publicly, watching you lose everything. And now, she couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate the bizarre mix of emotions churning inside her. Guilt for misjudging him, rage at the people who'd manipulated her, grief that felt fresh and raw all over again. Alexandra looked at her with understanding that shouldn't have been possible given what she'd put him through. "And now you've discovered you married the wrong person," he said with bitter humor. "But for the wrong reasons. Married someone you were taught to hate because the real villains needed a scapegoat." They laughed then. Both of them. It was inappropriate, almost manic laughter that bubbled up from somewhere deep and slightly broken. The kind of laughter that happens when reality becomes so absurd that crying isn't enough anymore. Here they were, 2 people forced into marriage by conspiracy, both mourning the same person, both betrayed by people they should have been able to trust. The silence that followed their laughter was different than before. Not uncomfortable or tense, but somehow companionable. Like they'd crossed some invisible threshold into actual alliance rather than forced coexistence. "We need to expose them," she said finally, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "All of them. My father, my uncle, everyone involved. "We need to finish what my brother started." Alexandra nodded, and in his eyes she saw the same determination her brother must have seen months ago when he'd first approached the Duke with his discovery. "Together," Alexandra said, and it wasn't a question. It was a promise. A pact made at 3 in the morning between two unlikely allies who'd been pushed together by tragedy and stayed together by choice. They spent the rest of that night planning their strategy, how to gather evidence that would hold up in court, which nobles might be sympathetic to their cause versus those who were probably involved in the conspiracy, how to protect themselves during the investigation because these people had already killed once. They wouldn't hesitate to kill again if they felt threatened. Creating their strategy meant spending hours together every day. The library became their war room, covered in documents and ledgers and copied correspondence. They'd sit across from each other, trading theories, challenging assumptions, building a case so airtight that even the most powerful nobles couldn't wriggle free. And somewhere in that process, something shifted. She started seeing him, really seeing him, not as the Duke or the accused or even the ally, just Alexandra. A man who'd sacrificed his reputation to honor a dead friend's last wish. A man who'd accepted being hated because it kept her safer than knowing the truth. A man who read philosophy at night and taught orphans to read and carried grief so quietly you'd never know it was destroying him from the inside. Those long hours of working together revealed sides of Alexandra she'd never imagined existed. Like how he'd quote poetry while reviewing financial documents, finding irony in the contrast between beautiful words and ugly corruption. How he had this dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, making her laugh at the most inappropriate moments. How he'd get this intense focus when he was onto something important, his whole body leaning forward like he could physically pull the truth from the pages in front of them. She found herself sharing stories about her brother, happy memories she'd locked away because they hurt too much to remember. Alexandra would listen with this soft expression, sometimes adding his own stories, painting a picture of her brother she'd never fully known. The vulnerability they shared during those weeks was unlike anything she'd experienced before. One night, while reviewing particularly damning evidence against her father, she broke down completely. Just dissolved into tears she'd been holding back since the garden conversation that started this whole nightmare. Alexandra didn't try to fix it or tell her it would be okay. He just moved his chair next to hers and sat there, solid and present, letting her cry without judgment or expectation. "He was your father," Alexandra said quietly, once her sobs slowed to hiccups. "It's okay to grieve that betrayal, even while you're fighting for justice. The two things can exist together." That understanding, that permission to feel conflicted, meant more than any comfort would have. They started sharing meals together, not out of obligation, but because isolation felt wrong somehow. They'd discuss the investigation over dinner, sure, but also just talk about books they loved, about childhood memories, about dreams they'd had before life got complicated. She learned that Alexandra had wanted to be a teacher before inheriting his title, that his terrifying reputation had been deliberately cultivated to keep people at a distance after his parents died in suspicious circumstances. "If people fear you, they don't get close enough to use you," he explained. "But it's lonely. God, it's so lonely being the monster everyone expects you to be." She understood that loneliness in a way she couldn't have before. Understood how betrayal teaches you to trust no one, even when trust is exactly what you need to survive. And somewhere between reviewing evidence and sharing grief, between strategy sessions and quiet dinners, something else began growing. She'd catch herself watching him when he wasn't looking, noticing details she'd missed before. The way his jaw tightened when he was angry. How his eyes softened when he talked about her brother. The careful way he moved around her, always conscious of her space and comfort. He never pressured her for anything, never took advantage of their forced proximity, never acted like their marriage gave him rights over her body or choices. That restraint, that respect, was so different from every expectation society had taught her about husbands and wives. It was the foundation of something that felt suspiciously like trust. Maybe even more than trust. The night they finally compiled all their evidence into an unassailable case, they sat back and looked at each other with a mixture of triumph and terror. They'd done it. They had enough proof to expose the entire conspiracy, to bring down powerful nobles, to get justice for her brother. But they both knew what came next would be dangerous. These people would fight back with everything they had. "Are you scared?" she asked him. Alexandra smiled. A real smile, not the careful mask he wore in public. "Terrified," he admitted. "But your brother taught me that some things are worth being terrified for. Truth, justice, doing what's right, even when it costs you everything." He reached across the table and took her hand. "We finish this together. For him. And maybe—" He hesitated, then finished softly. "Maybe for us, too. You know that phoenix everyone talks about? The one that rises from the ashes? Everyone focuses on the rebirth part, the triumphant resurrection, the beautiful moment of transformation. But they forget what comes before, the burning, the complete destruction of everything you were. You can't become something new without first letting the old version die, and that death isn't peaceful or painless. It's fire and agony and letting go of every illusion you've clung to for survival." The day they exposed the conspiracy was the day her old life burned to ashes. Everything she'd believed about family, about loyalty, about who deserved her trust, all of it had to die before something truer could take its place. The morning they presented their evidence to the royal court felt surreal, like watching herself move through a dream where consequences felt both inevitable and impossible. She stood beside Alexandra in front of judges and nobles, with documents spread across tables like accusations made physical. Her hands trembled as they laid out the proof. Her brother's diary, financial records showing years of theft, correspondence between conspirators, payment receipts for hired assassins. Each piece of evidence was another nail in coffins they were building for people she'd once loved. Her father sat in the audience, his military posture crumbling as the revelation unfolded. She watched his face cycle through denial, anger, and finally, resignation. He knew they had him. There was no talking his way out of documentation this thorough. Her uncle was a different story entirely. He denied everything, even with proof staring him in the face, his voice rising in indignation that would have been convincing if you didn't know the truth. "This is fabricated, a conspiracy against distinguished families. That woman has been manipulated by Thornfield. Everyone knows he's dangerous." But his protests rang hollow when they presented his own journal, his own handwriting detailing the murder like it was a solved problem rather than a destroyed life. She watched nobles she'd known since childhood shift uncomfortably as their names appeared in documents. Watched them try to distance themselves from each other, suddenly claiming they'd had suspicions or never fully trusted their co-conspirators. Cowards, all of them. At least her uncle owned his evil until the end, even if he wouldn't admit guilt. The moment that broke her completely was seeing her father led away in chains. Despite everything, despite his betrayal, his complicity, his choice to sacrifice both his children for political survival, he was still her father. She'd sat on his shoulders as a child. He'd taught her to ride horses. He'd been her hero once, before she understood that heroes in stories are much simpler than humans in reality. Alexandra squeezed her hand as guards took her father past them. Her father looked at her then, really looked at her, and whatever he saw in her face made him stop. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Just those two words. Not an explanation or an excuse. Just an acknowledgement that sorry couldn't fix what he'd broken. She didn't respond. Couldn't. What do you say to a father who chose wrong so catastrophically? The trial lasted 3 days. 3 days of testimony and cross-examination and watching powerful people crumble under the weight of their own codes of corruption. The court found them guilty on all charges: conspiracy, theft, murder, obstruction of justice. Her uncle received a death sentence. Her father, because of his cooperation in the final hours and his military service, received life imprisonment instead. The other nobles involved got varying sentences based on their level of participation. Justice was served, they said. The system worked, they claimed. But sitting in that courtroom, watching sentences handed down like items on a shopping list, she felt empty rather than victorious. Her brother was still dead. No verdict could bring him back. No punishment could undo what had been lost. When it was finally over, when the last conspirator had been sentenced and the court dismissed, she walked out into afternoon sunlight that felt too bright for the darkness they'd just exposed. Alexandra walked beside her, silent and solid, understanding that sometimes there are no words adequate for the moment. They'd won. They'd gotten justice for her brother. They'd exposed corruption that had been festering for years. But victory tasted like ashes in her mouth. "I thought I'd feel different," she admitted quietly as they stood on the courthouse steps. "Thought justice would feel like, I don't know, relief? Closure? Something other than this emptiness?" Alexandra nodded, his own expression reflecting that same hollow feeling. Justice doesn't heal grief. It just stops the wound from getting worse. They organized a memorial service for her brother the following week. Not the rushed, politically motivated funeral that had happened right after his death, but a real celebration of who he'd been. They invited people he'd actually cared about, not nobles performing grief for social benefit, but friends, servants he'd treated with kindness, children from the orphanage he'd visited regularly. Alexandra spoke about their friendship, about her brother's courage and integrity and refusal to ignore wrongdoing even when silence would have been safer. She shared stories that made people laugh, memories of her brother's terrible singing voice, his habit of reading while walking and bumping into furniture, the way he'd adopt every stray animal he found. For the first time since his death, she honored who he actually was, rather than who people had tried to make him in memory. After the service, after everyone had left, she and Alexandra stood by her brother's grave in comfortable silence. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cemetery, and birds sang in trees that didn't care about human tragedy or triumph. "Our marriage started as a prison," Alexandra said suddenly, his voice quiet but clear. "A cage built by people who wanted to keep us both silent and controlled. But it doesn't have to stay that way. You're free now. You've always been free, really. I never wanted to be your jailer. If you want to annul the marriage, I'll sign whatever papers are necessary. You deserve the choice that was stolen from you." His offer was genuine. She could hear it in his voice. He'd let her go without complaint, without guilt, without making her feel obligated to stay. And that's when she realized something that probably should have been obvious weeks ago, but had crept up on her so gradually she'd missed it. Somewhere between hating him and understanding him, between seeking justice and sharing grief, between working as allies and becoming friends, she'd fallen in love with him. Not the dramatic sweep you off your feet kind of love from novels, but the real kind, the kind built on respect and trust, and seeing someone at their worst and choosing them anyway. The kind that grows in the spaces between words, in shared silences and unspoken understanding. She'd fallen in love with the man society called a monster, the man who'd been willing to be hated to honor a dying friend's wish, the man who'd stood beside her while she destroyed her own family in the name of truth. "I don't want an annulment," she said, turning to face him fully. Alexandra looked surprised, like he'd been bracing himself for her to accept his offer and walk away. "Our marriage started as a prison, yes, but it doesn't have to be defined by how it began. We get to decide what it becomes." She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his the way he'd done for her so many times during their investigation. "You asked once if I was scared. I am. Terrified, actually. But not of you. Not anymore. I'm scared of trusting this, of believing something good can come from something that started so wrong. But my brother taught me, through his life and his death, that the most important things require courage. So I'm choosing courage. I'm choosing you. I'm choosing us, if you want that too." Alexandra pulled her close then, wrapping his arms around her in the first real embrace they'd shared since their forced wedding day. She felt him trembling slightly, felt the careful restraint he'd maintained for months finally breaking. "I've wanted that since the moment you barged into my room at 3 a.m, he admitted against her hair. "Wanted you to see me instead of the reputation. Wanted to deserve the trust you were giving me, even while you thought you hated me. Wanted—" He pulled back just enough to look at her face. "Wanted to be worthy of the woman who fought for truth, even when it cost her everything she'd known." The kiss that followed wasn't desperate or passionate like in dramatic stories. It was soft and careful and full of promise. The first real kiss of their marriage, given freely rather than as obligation. They stood there in the cemetery as the sun set. Two people who'd been broken by conspiracy and betrayed by family, who'd found each other in the wreckage and chosen to build something new. The traces of their pain would always be there. Grief doesn't just disappear because you've found happiness. But alongside that grief, they'd discovered something neither had expected to find. Hope. Real, fragile, beautiful hope that maybe the story didn't end with tragedy. Maybe, just maybe, there was room for renewal too. For love built on honesty rather than illusion. For a marriage that began in darkness but could grow toward light. Her brother had died seeking truth, and in honoring his memory by finishing what he started, she'd found not just justice, but something she'd thought was lost forever, a future worth fighting for. So here we are, at the end of a story that started with hatred and ended with understanding, with forced marriage that became chosen partnership, with a quest for revenge that transformed into a fight for truth. But here's the real question, the one that matters more than any fictional tale. What are you going to do with this? Because stories are entertaining, sure, but they're worthless unless they change something in you, unless they make you think differently, act differently, see the world with clearer eyes than you had before. Let me ask you something personal. How many times have you believed a story about someone without questioning it? How often have you accepted the narrative you were handed without digging deeper, without looking for those cracks in the porcelain, without holding it up to the light to see what's really there? We all do it. It's human nature to take the easy path, to trust the people we're supposed to trust, to believe that our version of reality is the accurate one. But what if it's not? What if, like her, you're missing crucial pieces of the puzzle because someone found it convenient to hide them from you? Here's what I want you to think about today. Who in your life deserves a second look? Not because they're accused of murder, let's keep this practical, but because maybe you've judged them based on reputation rather than reality. Maybe you've accepted someone else's opinion as fact. Maybe you've been so convinced of your own narrative that you've missed contradicting evidence right in front of you. It takes courage to question what you think you know. It takes even more courage to admit you might have been wrong. But that courage? That's where growth lives. That's where truth hides, waiting for someone brave enough to find it. And what about the flip side? What about the people you trust without question? Family, friends, mentors, people who've earned your loyalty over years. Here's the uncomfortable truth this story reveals. Sometimes the people closest to us are capable of betrayal we'd never imagine. Not because they're monsters, but because they're human. Because they're scared or selfish or convinced their reasons justify their actions. Does that mean you should trust no one? Absolutely not. But it means you should trust wisely. It means keeping your eyes open even when your heart wants to stay closed to painful possibilities. Now, let's talk about something even more practical. What are you accepting in your life right now that doesn't feel right? What situation are you staying in because leaving feels impossible? Because duty demands it? Because everyone expects it? She could have stayed in that marriage miserable and bitter. Could have spent her whole life hating a man who didn't deserve it, while the real villains went unpunished. Instead, she chose to investigate, to question, to risk everything for truth, even when ignorance would have been more comfortable. What would your life look like if you had that same courage? If you stopped accepting the unacceptable just because changing it feels hard? Here's what I know for certain. Transformation doesn't happen in comfort zones. It doesn't happen when you're playing it safe, when you're accepting the status quo, when you're letting other people write your story. It happens when you grab that metaphorical hot pan and choose to hold on long enough to understand what you're really dealing with. When you walk down that aisle toward your fear instead of running away from it. When you sit at 3 in the morning with the truth that's breaking your heart and decide to let it break you open rather than closed. That's where real change lives, in the painful spaces between who you were and who you're becoming. So here's my challenge to you, and I'm serious about this. Pick one story you've accepted without question. One narrative about a person, a situation, a limitation you think you have. Just one, and investigate it. Look for evidence that contradicts what you believe. Ask questions you've been avoiding. Be willing to discover you were wrong, because being wrong means you can learn something true. Do it this week. Not someday, not when it's convenient, but in the next 7 days. Write it down. Make it real. Because knowledge without application is just entertainment. And you didn't stick with this story just to be entertained. You're here because something in you recognizes that truth matters more than comfort. And let me leave you with this final thought. Love, real love, the kind worth having, isn't built on illusions. It's not constructed from pretty lies and convenient narratives. It's forged in the fire of seeing someone completely, flaws and pain and scars included, and choosing them anyway. That goes for romantic love, sure, but also for friendship, for family, for the relationship you have with yourself. Stop accepting surface-level connections. Stop pretending everything's fine when it's not. Stop loving the version of people you wish existed instead of the reality of who they are. The deepest connections happen when two people are brave enough to be honest, even when honesty is terrifying. Are you going to keep living with comfortable lies? Or are you ready to fight for uncomfortable truths? Are you going to stay trapped in narratives other people wrote for you? Or are you going to investigate and discover your own story? Are you going to hate the wrong people while the real problems go unaddressed? Or are you going to have the courage to look deeper, question harder, and demand better from others and from yourself? Those aren't rhetorical questions. They require answers, and those answers require action. If this story resonated with you, if something in these words sparked recognition or curiosity or that uncomfortable feeling that means you're about to grow, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel and activate notifications because we're going to keep exploring these themes: betrayal and truth, forced choices, and real freedom. The courage it takes to see clearly when everyone around you is choosing blindness. We're going to dive into more stories from history and fiction that reveal timeless truths about human nature, about power and corruption, about love that transforms rather than imprisons. This is just the beginning of uncovering mysteries that matter. The question is, are you brave enough to keep digging? Are you ready to question everything and rebuild from truth rather than illusion? Because that's what we're doing here. Not just telling stories, but learning how to live with more courage, more honesty, more depth than the world typically demands. Hit that subscribe button if you're in. Turn on notifications if you're serious. And most importantly, take what you've learned today and actually use it. Your life is the only story that really matters. Make sure you're writing it based on truth, not lies someone else found convenient. Now go investigate, go question, go discover. The truth is waiting for someone brave enough to find it.